Let's continue this conversation on the trade tensions and the tariffs that are happening off G7, as well as how that translates and how it plays out with Asia-Pacific, specifically China. I know you've said that what's happening with Trump's America First agenda is good for China. Explain that further.
It's clearly good because the U.S. is only isolating itself further, and most importantly, after the technological arms race that the U.S. has basically launched against China, which is only going to accelerate China's moving up the ladder, the last thing that the U.S. should do, and has actually done in this G7 meeting, is to isolate itself from its Western allies. So if you think about everything, from G5, from anything that China is pushing, say, in Europe, at this very instance, Europe is going to say, do I have an ally to basically say no to the Chinese in this alliance on G5? And the answer is not really, not anymore. So in a nutshell, no matter how unwillingly both Canada and Europe are versus China in terms of, feeling that they don't have enough negotiating power, market access, you name it, but the U.S. is just basically further apart from them. So in a way, they have no choice but getting closer, reluctantly, but closer to China.
Well, Alicia, let's look at one thing that Donald Trump, again, very disruptive, unexpected, said, let's make the G7 a free trade zone. Let's get rid of everybody's tariffs. At this point in economic history, with so many powerful nations economically in the world, is that really so far-fetched to say, hey, why does anybody have tariffs on anyways?
Sure. I mean, this is the multilateral approach that Europe has been pushing forward for so many years. It's just, why do we have even tariffs? But the reality is that we're not there. We are now at a point in history where we have two hegemons. And the whole point is who wins this tech arms race, as I mentioned. And to do that, who has more allies of enough weight to push that battle further. And that's where we are. We're not in a multilateral environment anymore. So yes, you're right, but it just doesn't make sense when you have two similar, increasingly similar hegemons. That's where the U.S. stands now. And that is why I do believe that putting aside or putting, away from the U.S. allies that have been there since the Second World War, basically, is really not the right way to go.
Alicia, does this have any impact on the dynamics at the big central bank meetings this week, particularly for the U.S. and the European Central Bank?
Well, of course, it only adds more uncertainty to their environment. Their environment is uncertain in two ways. For the U.S., to me, the most obvious issue is fiscal policy. And I think after what we've seen with Trump lately, we can only expect to have, of course, a bigger fiscal deficit, but how big, we don't know. And on the revenue side, the measures are not clear. So I just think that is what is really at the table at this point in time, with full employment, inflationary pressures moving up, and this fiscal stimulus. On the ECB side, though, this is country risk, of course, especially from Italy, and a much weaker economy than we were expecting at the beginning of the year. So I would argue that, if anything, monetary policy divergence between Europe and the U.S. is going to increase.